Alright, you guys, this episode of Hip Hop Hot Seat is called The Legacy of Old Block and King Von. King Von was the type of individual who had an edge about him that was distinguishable from a lot of other up and coming rappers who were also making their debut around the time when he first came out. You could just tell that he had a different kind of swag about him and that he moved different when you've seen him interact with other members of his crew, the Old Block, a faction of the Black Disciples out of Chicago. The other thing that stood out about King Von is that he was always in some type of drama, and he wasn't the type of guy who tried to avoid it. In fact, some would say that he actually enjoyed it, and that he had a strong propensity for violence, and that this was part of who he was. And whether it's in the rap game or within the gang culture, it's a well-proven fact that those individuals who have a long history of committing acts of violence are individuals who are respected and feared on the streets. This is why King Von had acquired the level of respect that he had, because he was a hitter, and he became one of Old Block's biggest shooters. When you put it all in perspective, it's kind of sad because King Von lived a short, troublesome life and was definitely taken out prematurely. Even by his own description of his life, he could never see himself be anything but an Old Block gang member. He was too deeply rooted in the game, and he said he had too much love for his guys to ever get out. For this reason, I don't think it came as much of a surprise when King Von met his tragic and sudden demise on November 6, 2020 at the Monaco Hookah Lounge in Atlanta. You almost expect someone like King Von, who lived a gunslinger type of lifestyle, to die a violent death in a hail of bullets, staying true to the way he lived. In the streets, this gives credence to one of the lamest terms I've ever heard. A term a lot of these weenies loosely throw around when they say, "He was a real one," or "I'm a real one." I don't know how many times I've heard some of these cats either call themselves real ones or refer to someone else as a real one, but it's laughable. 9 times out of 10, whenever someone claims that they're a real one, they usually have no concept of what being real is all about. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. That all comes down to personal perspective. However, I don't believe that dying a violent death makes you real. King Von's death reminds me of another prominent rapper who also died violently and way before his time. And in my opinion, he was probably the greatest rapper and lyricist I will probably ever see in my entire lifetime, Tupac. I'm not making a comparison of the two as far as rapping goes, because King Von don't come anywhere even close to Pac. But what I am comparing is how they choose to live their lives and the level of drama they freely welcomed. Prior to getting signed with Death Row Records, Tupac was a rapper and an entertainer in every sense of the expression. He did his thing with Digital Underground, and he began to flourish as an up-and-coming, aspiring rapper. Then he went solo before trying his hand as an actor. At that point, he looked like he was on track to lock down a promising and successful career. But from there, things just kind of went downhill. He had legal issue after legal issue, and we all kind of seen his accomplishments spiral out of control. Eventually, he ended up in Rikers Island, which would set the stage for what was a bittersweet opportunity to sign with a very successful record label like Death Row. For Tupac, this meant he'd immediately be bailed out. A lot of his financial quandaries would be put behind him, and he'd be back to doing what he loved most, to get back in the studio and start cutting albums. Death Row, on the other hand, seen a golden opportunity, and Suge Knight, being the savvy businessman that he was, pounced on it. He knew he would present Tupac with a breath of fresh air, and that it would almost be impossible for Tupac to turn it down. Why not? Anyone who's had their freedom snatched away from them and who has accumulated a litany of legal problems surely couldn't refuse to be given their freedom back, not when it's being dangled in front of them. But this was only a short-term solution to all the problems that were festering in his life, and it came with a lot of drawbacks. Drawbacks that neither he or anyone else could possibly have predicted. Getting signed with Death Row Records meant that Pac would forge close bonds with the likes of Suge Knight, Al Buntrey, Neckbone, Haram, Big J, Trey, Big Rock, and other members of the Bloods from Looters Park Pyru, Westside Pyru, Mob Pyru, Elm Street Pyru, and Fruitown Pyru. We all know Pac wasn't a Pyru or a Blood, let alone a gang member. That's just not who he was, and that's not where he came up. But Pac was a loyal dude, and it was his loyalty with those he fucked with that got him killed. He got caught up in that whole prestigious mentality of proving yourself and showing out in front of the people that you run with that a lot of gang members themselves get caught up in, wanting to be the first one to throw a punch, to be the one to get off the first shot when you're out there on the streets and you end up beefing with other gangs. Pac knew he wasn't a Pyru, but that's who he was surrounded with, and in his mind, that's who he was riding with. He wasn't just going to be the golden boy rapper that Suge brought in and take a backseat when the funk kicked off. That wasn't his style. If he fuck with you, he rock with you, period. But after everything that happened, it's funny how cats like King James bashed on Pac for trying to be loyal to the people he was running with. Instead of giving him his props for riding with him and for doing what he did, King James bashed on Pac, basically saying it was his fault. He wasn't from the hood and he shouldn't have got involved. It doesn't surprise me though, because Tupac wasn't the only one King James burned after turning sour himself. King Von, on the other hand, was a righteous gang member who was affiliated with the faction of the Black Disciples O Block gang. His death adheres to the common pattern in the lives of up-and-coming rap and hip-hop artists. In the last few years, other artists such as Nipsey Hussle, Pop Smoke, and Little Marlo have all been shot and killed. Many of these shootings are connected to gang activity, rivalries between rappers, and envy over their success. The discography of hip-hop artists increasingly depicts life on the streets in cities across the nation, projecting the cultures of neighborhoods in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, and Oakland, creating a chronicle of street life. However, the fame that their music earns them contributes to a vicious cycle of envy and violence going back decades and serves as a lesson to upcoming rappers. King Von grew up on the south side of Chicago in an apartment complex called Parkway Gardens, also known as O Block. He started rapping in 2014, eventually signing to his childhood friend Lil Durk's label, Only the Family, in 2017. While living in Chicago, he encountered legal troubles as a member of O Block. Following the release of his breakout single Crazy Story in 2018, he moved to Atlanta, the world's de facto hip-hop capital, to escape the Chicago Police Department, which continually harassed him, and the old enemies, and to advance his career. A week before he was killed, on October 30, 2020, Von released Welcome to O Block, his debut album. Welcome to O Block chronicles street life and especially street violence, as many of Von's previous songs and mixtapes did. After an argument between his entourage and another, shots were fired in the Monaco Hookah Lounge. But this wasn't just an argument that ignited over a bunch of posturing and flexing. This was actually from the result of a long-standing feud that had been brewing between a lot of different people who were either affiliated with O Block or NBA Youngboys camp. On the night of the altercation, 6 people were apparently seriously injured, and 2, Von and Mark Blakely, a member of his entourage, died from their injuries. The day after, on November 7, 2020, Timothy Leaks, a 22-year-old rapper also known as Lil Tim or Lil Tim, was arrested on 1 count of felony murder in the death of Von. Lil Tim is affiliated with Quando Rondo, a Savannah-born rapper who was also involved in the altercation. Lil Tim and Rondo are both members of the Gangster Disciples, another Chicago-based gang who are rivals of the Black Disciples. Both Lil Tim and Rondo were also affiliated with NBA Youngboy, which was what really fueled the altercation. Unfortunately, what happened to Von is starting to become a trend for young, successful African-American rappers who come from real gang-related backgrounds. They go on to become successful rappers, but then some of them use that success to continue gangbanging and to elevate their status on the streets. Other prominent rappers who have recently been killed were Pop Smoke, who was killed on February 20th, 2020, MO3, who was killed on November 15th, 2020, and Little Marlo, who was killed on July 11th, 2020. Pop Smoke was killed during a robbery at a house he was renting in Los Angeles. The 4 cats who were convicted of killing him are all members of a South Los Angeles street gang. Pop Smoke, on the other hand, had ties to 823 Crips and GS9 gangs who were active in Brooklyn, where he grew up. Melvin Noble, whose stage name was MO3, was gunned down during the car chase in Dallas. MO3 called himself a gang member turned rapper. Nobody was caught for his murder. But if you take it back even a few years before these guys lost their lives, Nipsey Hussle, who was killed on March 31st, 2019, and Triple X, who was killed on June 18, 2018, are among those who were also murdered. Nip was shot outside the store-owned, the Marathon Clothing in Crenshaw District in southern LA by fellow gang member Eric Little Shitty Holder. Before his death, he was open about his membership in the Rolling 60s as a teen while saying he was lucky to make it out unscathed. These tragedies, which stretch back to the 80s and beyond, are evidence of what happens when street relationships, often formed in future rappers' youth, turn sour. A common lyrical thread among a lot of rappers is an early life of struggle and survival. Many base their identities on the neighborhoods they grew up in. Nipsey's lyrics contain countless references to the Crenshaw district from Slauson Avenue, Hustle in the House, the center of the neighborhood, to 59th Street, Dedication featuring Kendrick Lamar, where his grandmother lived. The same is true of King Von, whose tracks are dominated by drill, Chicago's unique style of trap music. These narratives are part of the origin stories of many rappers. Many find themselves drawn to music as a means of escape from their upbringings. Teenagers across the country join gangs for protection, social connections that are missing within their family circle, or to make money. The music they make about this life is a reflection of the culture which others relate to and which contributes to their rise to stardom. However, the more fame they gain, the more complex their relationships with the gang becomes, and they become targets of attacks from enemies they gained during their youth or from envious haters. They may have been popular in certain cities or regions and the worlds of aficionados, but to the wider public, they remained unknown, their deaths occurring before a breakthrough that would have widened their popularity. Their deaths often become this breakthrough, but King Von's death was a lot more complex than that. There was a lot of different moving parts that ended up leading to the day that he died that a lot of people don't know about. Everything including betrayal, deception, gang politics, and even a claim of a lightweight issue between King Von and his boy Lil Durk. Everybody knows that these two were close and that they had each other's back. These guys weren't just childhood friends, they were also allegedly involved in a lot of dirt out there on the streets of Chicago. Recently, another rapper named Quando Rondo, who was actually a part of the altercation that led to King Von's death, exposed some of the inside details about what led to the conflict between his boy Lil Tim and Von. He also talked about some other things he claims he knew was going on between Lil Durk's girl India and Von. According to Quando Rondo, there was some type of inappropriate relationship going on between Lil Durk's girl India and King Von. He said he knew firsthand that Von was texting India on the side without Lil Durk's knowledge, insinuating that Von and India might have been fucking around behind Durk's back. Whether this is just a way of Quando Rondo creating waves and stirring the pot is anyone's guess, but people who were close to King Von and Lil Durk said that short of clearly betraying him, Lil Durk had Von's back no matter what was going on. That was his boy, and there just wasn't much that could come between these two. Keep in mind that Quando Rondo worked with another rapper, NBA Youngboy, out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. NBA Youngboy's camp and Lil Durk's camp were at odds with each other, especially after NBA Youngboy took the beef to social media and called Lil Durk out. When I say there was a lot of moving parts going on with all these different beefs that escalated between O Block and other gangs such as the GD's Gangster Disciples, this is clearly an understatement. There was so many different beefs that were going on back and forth that it's almost hard not to lose track and get lost in the confusion. I'm going to try to put some of the more noteworthy beefs into perspective that amped up the tensions and led to some of the murders that spanned over almost a decade. But just keep in mind that there's a lot of different faces who are involved on both sides of the specter. The other thing people need to be aware of is that, contrary to what people might think, King Von was young when he turned into a street demon and started racking up a body count. In fact, he was still getting locked up in juvenile hall when the bloodletting first started. So one of the trends that I've noticed that is becoming more and more common amongst a lot of these gangs these days is how active they are on social media and how they're using social media platforms as sounding boards to push and facilitate their agendas. This is what makes this generation so different. I mean, the internet didn't even exist when I was in my teens, but even if it was around back then, the mindset was completely different. These guys literally post everything: their guns, their money, who they're beefing with, and other incriminating things like stolen jewelry or attire they were wearing hours prior after they admitted to having been involved in a crime. We were secretive and low-key, trying to stay under the radar. But this generation today is a lot more aggressive, who want to be recognized, and they want their ops to know that they're active in the streets. Another factor in all this is that this is all amped up by the fact that some of these guys are aspiring rappers and seem to get lost in the attention they get on social media. They get caught up in the prestige of being celebrities, and this is dangerous. One of the things that King Von was known for, something he did religiously, was to rap about some of the details of his crimes and the bodies he was dropping after the crimes were committed. These tweets or postings were ominous warnings and menacing messages intended for his ops to hear, but as he became more indiscriminate, he spoke less and less without filter, directly to his victims and those who were affiliated with them. But some of Von's ops were doing the same thing. Some members from the STL, FBG, and EBT, St. Lawrence, Flyboy Gang, or Ebert Avenue communicated directly with Von through social media to brag and boast about the murders they were committing on their end as well. Although some people think that STL, EBT are one gang, they're actually separate gangs. They're just so closely allied that people often say them together. Again, STL is for a street called St. Lawrence, and EBT is for another street that's in close proximity called Ebert Avenue. Hence, the rivalry that resulted in a lot of the bloodshed that King Von would later become involved in was between his gang, O-Block, a faction of the Black Disciples, and the STL, EBT, FBG gangs, who are all factions of the Gangster Disciples. For those of you that don't know, it's been said that an individual named Wooski, who was affiliated with STL FBG, was actually the one who kicked off the war between these two sets. But Wooski had several brothers that had different ties to different sets. One of his older brothers, Ron, was from Mobtown, ABM Dark Gang, aka KG400 from Nashville, Treetop Pyrus. But it was his other older brother, Big Mike, that puts a strange spin on this story. Big Mike claimed O-Block, a gang that was sworn enemies to Wooski's gang, STL FBG. When it came to his loyalty, however, Wooski's position was never in question, but Wooski had an abundance of respect for his older brother Big Mike, and at times these lines will become blurred. Since Wooski actually lived in the heart of O-Block with his brother, he would leave the neighborhood during the day and go to STL FBG, where he would kick it and post up with other members of that gang. A lot of O-Block members apparently knew about Wooski and his affiliation to STL FBG, but nobody really made an issue out of it, more so out of respect for his older brother Big Mike. They basically gave him a pass and never really pressed him about it. This, however, was before all the drama started. In the beginning, when the conflict first kicked off between these sets, they would always fight on sight whenever they would see each other. They'd catch each other slacking somewhere out of bounds, and they would just go back and forth fighting. All it was in the beginning was fisticuffs. There wasn't no gunplay. It was always just small squabbles at parties, in the schools, or somewhere in the neighborhood. But Wooski changed all this. It's been said that he was one of the first ones, if not the first one from his generation, to pull out a gun and start shooting at his ops. On one of these occasions, a fight apparently broke out between O-Block gang members and STL FBG gang members. By this time, the back and forth fighting was becoming more frequent, and there was nothing different about this incident from past skirmishes these guys had gotten into. It was just another brawl. But then Wooski pulled out a gun and shot an O-Block member named Little Reese, point blank, killing him right there on the spot. Little Reese just so happened to be one of King Von's closest friends. Von was actually there when it happened, and he watched Little Reese take his last breath. This was a defining moment in the ensuing conflict, and was the reason why Von held a lot of animosity and hatred towards STL, FBG, and more specifically towards Wooski himself. Von respected Wooski's older brother Big Mike and embraced him as a fellow O-Block member, but this wasn't going to be a reason for stopping Von and other members from O-Block from trying to kill Wooski. He was now considered an enemy, and there wasn't going to be anything stopping them from taking him out. But Wooski was a rider. He was by no means someone to play with. In fact, Wooski became one of STL FBG's biggest shooters. Every chance he got, he was sliding through O-Block, shooting at people and making his presence known. At this time, he wasn't taking King Von serious either. because King Von hadn't really transformed into the street demon that he would later become yet. He was just another O Block member, not really known for racking up a body count or killing people like he would later. He was a fighter who was always in the fray, but he just hadn't stepped up his game yet, and his reputation was still being established. Meanwhile, Wooski had become a major target for Von. He didn't know it yet, but Von went on a crusade, almost to the point of this becoming an obsession for him. He wanted Wooski to suffer the same type of pain his boy Little Reese did the day he watched him take his last breath. On a couple occasions, Von almost caught Wooski slipping in O Block, where he still lived, but Wooski kept getting away. This is when Von allegedly killed an individual by the name of Modell, who was a cousin of Wooski's. Von resorted to going after family or those close to Wooski since he couldn't get Wooski himself. This is when the conflict started to really escalate. The killing of Modell only resulted in turning Wooski up even more, but it also made Wooski realize that Von was starting to become a major threat and someone that now became one of Wooski's main targets. Later on, people on the streets said that Von put a snitch jacket on Wooski's brother Big Mike. Von claimed that Big Mike couldn't keep his lips sealed. Depending on who you ask, others adamantly stood behind Big Mike, saying that this was all fabrication. These are the events that basically got the war started between these two gangs. But from this point on, a number of different members from each gang embarked in a deadly game to see who could drop the most bodies. Now in the beginning, there's another individual who was part of the legacy that played a significant role in the history of King Von, O Block, and all the murders that occurred. This individual turned out to be another street demon who would later be known for racking up a body count and for killing a lot of ops as well. And surprisingly enough, this individual was a female. Jakira Barnes, aka K.I., was a member of STL EBT, St. Lawrence and Ebert Avenue gang. Needless to say, she came from a tough upbringing growing up in Chicago, Illinois. Before she was even 1 year old, she was in the same room when her father's killer shot him in the head with a double-barrel shotgun. As she got older, she would end up following in her older brother's footsteps, who also was an STL FBG gang member, who went by FBG G.I. Joe. After school, K.I. started spending a lot more time in the hood and hanging out on the block, STL EBT 63rd, with one of the gang's most prominent members, Carlton Weekly, aka FBG Duck. When K.I. started hanging around with the gang, she wasn't a shooter in the beginning. This would come later after she began to develop a craving for violence and once she became more prolific at spilling blood. She started out fighting other girls from other neighborhoods like TYMB, aka Ty, You're My Brother, a Black Disciples gang from 65th in Maryland that's from Chicago's southeast side that's also affiliated Pro City. Not only were TYMB KI's biggest rivals, but they were also literally right across the street at Parkway Gardens, Wick City. But KI came from a different breed where it wasn't typical for females to show a strong propensity to commit the level of violence she was committing. And this is what set her apart. The more she hung out with the gang, the less she continued to associate with other females. She basically became one of the fellas, and in some cases, some would say that she had more heart than a lot of them. But things really escalated with KI after the killing of one of her closest friends, Jeremy Marshall, aka Little Foe. He was the blood cousin of another well-respected STL FBG gang member named FBG Chaos. Word on the curb was that Little Foe's killer was Wick City member O.D. Perry, who was on the fast track of making a reputation for being one of Wick City's biggest shooters. K.I. was apparently real close to Little Foe and took his killing to heart. Being that K.I. really didn't have a biological family, she embraced STL FBG as her only family, and this is why she took it to heart when some of those that were the closest to her were shot and killed in the streets. But it was yet still another killing that happened just a few months later that would set K.I. all the way off and turn her into the street demon that she would later become. Shondell Gregory, aka Tuka, was also a member of STL EBT, who K.I. was extremely close with. It was said that as Tuka sat at a bus stop, a car pulled up with 3 members of TYMB, some of K.I.'s biggest rivals, and another individual from Wick City, O.D. Perry. Tuka was basically executed. After the car pulled up, one of the vehicle's occupants jumped out with a ski mask on, holding a pistol. After exchanging a few words with Tuka, the gunman shot Tuka in the chest and then walked back over, stood over him, and pumped 3 more bullets into his head. Again, after Little Foe was killed, who K.I. was real close with, Tuka's murder just exasperated everything and sent K.I. into a murderous rampage. Word on the curb attributed the murder to O.D. Perry, the same individual who allegedly killed her other friend, Little Foe. After Tuka's murder, STL-EBT changed their name in honor of Tuka, calling themselves Tukaville. But what was done out of an act of honor and endearment only ended up creating fodder for yet another conflict. Whenever members of Tukaville would smoke trees, they would often say they were smoking on Tuka, just like the Outlaws did for the late great Tupac, as a way to pay respect. But the opposition of Tukaville would quickly transform this from an act of endearment into an act of disrespect. When rising Chicago rapper Chief Keef got a hold of the term, he would often rap about how he was smoking on Tuka as a means to disrespect and taunt their rivals from STL-EBT. But it wasn't just in songs or in the streets where the dead were being disrespected. Social media would then become one of the biggest battlegrounds for different gangs to go back and forth, making death threats and disrespecting each other's dead homies. This resulted in a drastic increase in violence amongst these gangs in the city. But Tuka's death turned K.I.'s heart completely black, and she couldn't see nothing but revenge. She vowed to make the streets bleed with Tuka's blood, and this is when K.I. turned into one of STL-EBT's biggest shooters. After Tuka's death, K.I. would be taken up under the wing of older STL-EBT member C-Ball, who was also close to Tuka and her cousin Bostrell, aka the Chicago Max Payne. It's said that he would teach the younger members of Tukaville about gunplay, how to handle their weapons, and how to kill. On August 10, 2011, the day of Tuka's birthday, STL-EBT decided to celebrate and pay homage to their fallen comrade Tuka. FBG Duck was filming his music video for his song Freestyle, and the whole Tukaville family was in attendance. Adrenaline was pumping, and everybody felt like Tuka's birthday would be the perfect time to get some givebacks. At around 11:30 p.m. that night, O.D. Perry was walking near Parkway Gardens when he was ambushed and shot multiple times, including a fatal shot to the neck. Members of Wick City would mourn the loss of O.D. Perry by renaming the block in his honor. But they weren't just about to let one of their most prominent members die without finding out who was behind it. This kicked the war up a few more notches, and now O-Block wanted to make the streets bleed too. Many people on the streets were speculating that it was Tukaville's top shooter, Marvell Williams, aka FBG Wooski. But thanks to a witness tip, the Chicago PD would already have 2 suspects, K.I. and her street mentor, Bostrell. But there were a lot of people who were skeptical. They didn't want to believe that a 14-year-old girl had taken the life of a well-respected Wick City member. But K.I. herself would silence anyone who doubted her abilities as one of Tukaville's top shooters by posting the evidence on Instagram. O.D. Perry was known for carrying a chrome .357 Magnum. It was his favorite gun, and he always carried it as a backup weapon. In fact, he could be seen carrying this weapon in multiple pictures, but it was said that after K.I. slid down on O.D. Perry and shot him, she took that gun from him and posted several pictures of her on social media posing with it as if it was a trophy. But by taking the life of O.D. Perry, K.I. would inadvertently create what would go on to become the most famous block in America, O-Block. After K.I. killed O.D. Perry, her reputation as a shooter around the city and her profile began to rise. It began to rise even more when fellow Tukaville member King Little J, who was a very popular rapper during the rise of the Chicago drill era, mentioned K.I. in several tracks. He was featured multiple times on a popular DJ academic series, War in Chirac. He would mention her in songs, rapping about how she was a shooter and about how she was putting the murder game down in the streets. Some members of Tukaville called K.I. Little Snoop, as in Felicia Pearson from the HBO television series The Wire. Her demeanor, her toughness, and how deadly she was reminded her gang of the character from the classic TV show. There was even rumors that her name K.I. stood for Killer Instinct. K.I. was now in the trenches of the Chicago gang wars. wars that by then were being supplied through very interesting origins. There were rumors and stories that the US military, namely the soldiers, were smuggling the weapons to certain gangs in Chicago, one of those gangs hailing from the south side. The Pockettown GDs, who were at that time in the middle of a very violent war with the crew from the east side known as Terrortown, NLMB, No Limit Muskegon Boys, with its most recognizable member being the rapper G Herbo. But this is just one of many stories of high-powered weapons meant for the battlefields of Afghanistan or Iraq, making their way into the inner city communities in the hands of young kids and teenagers waging war on one another. Meanwhile, death would once again take somebody close to KI, a 13-year-old boy by the name of Tyquan Tyler. People thought they were cousins, but Tyquan was more like a little brother to KI, and that's how she treated him. KI basically took Tyquan under her wing and tried to keep him out of trouble until his mom was able to save up enough money to move the family away. But unfortunately, Tyquan wouldn't make it that long. The streets would end up taking him before his mom could move him away to the new life she was desperately trying to build for him. One night at a party, KI was with Tyquan when a fight broke out amongst a group of guys who were at the party and shots rang out. Tyquan was struck in the chest by a stray bullet and subsequently died as a result. Although Tyquan's death didn't have anything to do with the O-Block conflict, KI still took Tyquan's death to heart, and these aggressions were then channeled back at O-Block. One theory that people were floating around about Tyquan's death had to do with KI teaching Tyquan gunplay and how to rob drug connections that she set up for him to rob. Some people believe that one of the connections that Tyquan robbed might have seen him that night, doubled back, and then shot him. Either way, a guy named Nathan Flowers would be the one arrested for Tyquan's murder, and he would ultimately get convicted and sentenced to 55 years in prison for killing Tyquan. One thing's for sure, all these people that were dying that were close to KI started to have a profound effect on her. It turned her heart colder and colder, and she began to elevate her shooting game out on the streets. After Tyquan's murder, she changed her social media name to Tyquan Assassin, and she also created a subset of STL EBT called Tyquan's World that was comprised of some of the youngest members in the gang. People like TBM Poppy, Richie Jerk, and 0078, who's probably most well known for allegedly killing one of the most feared shooters in Chicago gangland history, 051 Melly. Tyquan's World would also grow a fast reputation for dropping a lot of bodies. KI would instruct her youngins to slide on certain neighborhoods that they were beefing with, while she would go after the bigger targets, 800, TYMB, and especially O-Block. As the war progressed, KI started to understand the realities of wars producing casualties and that soldiers embraced this. This helped her embrace for yet another loss by a well-respected Tukaville member by the name of Marlon Monroe, aka Little Doc. On April 28, 2012, Little Doc was walking home from work on the 6300 block of South St. Lawrence Avenue when a gunman leaned out of a vehicle and sprayed the block up, striking Little Doc in the chest. Chicago PD arrived on the scene and began processing the crime scene. They collected and processed a lot of forensic evidence that they found in the area. Everything from bottles, cups, cigarette butts, and fingerprint evidence. In fact, they collected everything except for the body of Little Doc, who was laying there in a patch of tall weeds. Little Doc laid there dead for hours until a teenage boy stumbled across his body. Police were then called back out, where they then recovered Little Doc's body. In the months that followed, Tukaville and O-Block took to social media platforms and relentlessly went back and forth, disrespecting each other, mainly targeting the dead, who had become casualties of the war. When it came to O-Block, they liked to diss one EBT member in particular, Shondell Gregory, aka Tuka. They liked to diss Tuka because they knew how much he meant to EBT and the rest of the Tukaville members. Then, on September 25, 2012, something would happen that would forever tie KI to one of her biggest rivals from O-Block, King Von. Both KI and King Von were riding a train when they spotted each other. Although KI had heart and was willing to fight, she wasn't no match for Von. They traded punches, but Von ended up punching her in the face a bunch of times until it was basically over. From this point on, things took a strange turn between Von and KI. Both took to social media and tweeted about the incident, but later this seemed to lead to somewhat of an affinity between the two. What started out as a way to threaten and disrespect each other actually ended up leading to a flirtatious relationship. They would communicate indiscriminately over time, and it would eventually get to the point to where Vaughn kept trying to get K.I. to meet him somewhere. This perked her interest, and friends close to her said she actually entertained the idea, but she ultimately brushed it off, thinking that Vaughn was just trying to set her up. A few days after the train incident, K.I. tweeted Vaughn back, letting him know she had beat up an O Block member named Little Scud. The tweets between Vaughn and K.I. were at times cordial, but at the same time, neither Vaughn nor K.I. would have any qualms about letting each other know that they were still enemies. At one point, K.I. tweeted out something that was a disrespectful reference to O.D. Perry, in which Vaughn responded by saying, "I should have pissed or spit on you when I seen you on that train that day, but I wasn't thinking straight." K.I. responded back by making fun of O Block for not dropping any bodies and how it was Tukaville who was putting in all the work. Vaughn got so agitated that at one point he asked K.I. if she wanted to get into a shootout with him or something. K.I. said, "Hell yeah, with you and T-Roy." T-Roy being James Johnson, who was an O Block legend. Despite his small stature, he was known for being feared in the streets and for being quick with his gun. He was also best friends with King Von, and together they formed the deadly duo known as V-Roy. Meanwhile, K.I. would make good on her wish of wanting to have a shootout with them, because on October 9, 2012, King Von and T-Roy were spotted outside of the gates of O Block. It was said that K.I. along with FBG Cash ran down on them, spraying up the block and shooting King Von in the leg. However, they ended up surviving the attack. After this incident, King Von took to social media, making light of being shot in the leg. T-Roy, on the other hand, would take a more serious tone by simply tweeting out, "I'm gonna kill this bitch." But K.I. wasn't finished sliding on O Block. She then went on to shoot a female cousin of T-Roy's. She was actually arrested for this, but after questioning, she was released. At around this same time, she allegedly also tried to knock down her ex-boyfriend, Mikado 600, who was down with O Block. She seen him near Parkway Gardens and tried to run down on him, but he was able to escape. At this point, K.I. was doing too much, and now it was O Block's turn to slide. On October 13, 2012, three guys were walking on the 6300 block of South Rhodes Avenue. Richie Jerk, Modell McKimbry, and his cousin, Miles Turner, were going to a female acquaintance's house. Once they arrived at the house, Modell's cousin, Miles, went up to the porch to talk to their female friend. Modell and Richie started walking down the block when three men appeared from a gangway out of the darkness. Richie Jerk hit the burners and was able to escape, but Modell was hit 5 times. Miles was still on the porch when the shooting started and wasn't originally hit. But as he was attempting to console his cousin Modell and was on his knees holding him in his arms, the three gunmen made the decision not to leave behind any witnesses and shot him multiple times in the back as he was still clutching Modell. The three gunmen were King Von, T-Roy, and J Money. At the time, they left Miles for dead, but miraculously, he ended up surviving. Modell was a member of Tukaville along with Richie Jerk, but Miles Turner had no gang affiliations. He was a high school football player at Leo High School who had dreams of playing college football. However, those dreams would now be cut short as he was hit in the spine and paralyzed from the waist down. After Modell's murder, Vaughn would again take to social media, disrespecting him and making references to his murder. But O Block wasn't done putting in work. They kept their foot on Tukaville's neck, sliding on another Tukaville member named Derek Johnson, aka P5. As P5 was walking on the 6200 block of South Eberhart Avenue, three men, Big A from O Block, J Money, and King Von. He was shot 6 times in the head and 9 times in the body. Although he hailed from Gyro City, he had strong ties to Tukaville. The day before P5's murder, King Von tweeted out how he needed to catch another body so he could finally catch up with his best friend T-Roy. O Block still wasn't done yet. In fact, they were just getting started. The pressure was on STL EBT, and they had no plans of letting up anytime soon. On the morning of November 8, 2012, 17-year-old Bostrell was found lying face down in an alley on the 2600 block of West 83rd Street. It was said that he was out that way, far away from Tukaville and out of bounds in O Block territory to meet a girlfriend. When he arrived, he was confronted by 3 gunmen instead: J Money, T Roy, and King Von, who had all conspired to set him up. They convinced his ex-girlfriend to double-cross him and lure him right into their trap. Bostrell was a high-profile Tukaville member, and he was a high priority for O Block. He allegedly killed 2 of their most beloved members. On September 13, 2011, 18-year-old Devon Varner, aka D-Thang, the co-creator of 600 Would Be Down, was shot to death by FBG Wooski, Dawn from Gyro City, and Bostrell. It was also said that he was responsible for the murder of 19-year-old Sharoy Liggins. On February 16, 2012, Sharoy was leaving a store near O Block, but when he was walking out, Bostrell was across the street and had a gun with a red laser beam affixed to it. He shot Sharoy in the head from a distance, but he wouldn't die right away. He would be left in the hospital fighting for his life. He would eventually pass away 4 days later, in which Tukaville members immediately took to social media making references about his murder and the red laser beam that was used to put him in the crosshairs. Furthermore, the same gun could be seen in the FBG Duck and King Little J video, critical with Bostrell pointing a red laser beam directly at the camera. K.I., who was extremely close to Bostrell, vowed to personally get revenge for his murder and swore in his name that she'd be the one to do it. Meanwhile, another rumor that was circulating in the streets was that K.I. was performing contract jobs and murder for hire. There was a message thread that was later released from K.I.'s DMs between her and an unknown individual talking about the possibility of taking out a high-profile rapper. As they were trying to work out the details of the transaction, the conversation abruptly ended with K.I. simply saying $10K for Little Herb up front. Little Herb being G Herbo, getting fast money, living a fast life. But she still wanted revenge for so many of her friends who had recently fallen: Modell, P5, and her mentor, Bostrell. K.I. wanted serious get back on O Block. On September 2nd, 2013, she would get that opportunity at revenge because 21-year-old Jerome Woods, aka J Money, who was best friends with King Von and T Roy, and who had gone on multiple hits with them that included the murder of Bostrell, would be set up in a very similar way. When J Money arrived to the 6600 block of South Rhodes Avenue, he thought he was going to meet a female friend. Instead, he was met by 2 gunmen, with one of those gunmen being Rashawn Shaw, aka Little B, No Surrender, one of the top shooters out of STL EBT. When J Money realized he was being set up, he tried to run through a gangway but was shot multiple times in the back. As he collapsed on the ground, the other gunman walked up, stood over him as he laid there, and put 4 more bullets into his head. Immediately following the death of J Money, Little B tweeted out about it. K.I. would also tweet out about people getting shot in the head at point blank range. Then she just flat out said J Money didn't use his head, so we took it off. Tukaville had just stepped up the score. STL EBT celebrated the death of J Money because they knew how much J Money meant to O Block. But not long after Little B killed J Money, Little B would suffer the same fate. He was gunned down on Eberhart and Rhodes on 63rd. However, Little B didn't die from his ops over in O Block. Instead, he died from his ops over in Chicago PD. According to the officer that shot Little B, he claimed that Little B ran from him and that he thought he seen him pointing a gun seconds before he opened fire. O Block didn't do it, but they still took to social media and embraced Little B's killing as a victory to them. This killing probably bothered K.I. the most out of all of them, and the fact that O Block was celebrating his death only infuriated her. She wanted her enemies to feel the same pain she was feeling, especially Chief Keef, who had dissed Tukaville for many years. On April 10, 2014, 30-year-old Mario Hess, aka Blood Money, and the cousin of Chief Keef, was sitting in front of his family's home in West Inglewood when he was approached by a gunman and shot multiple times. Just 2 weeks prior, he had signed a major deal with Interscope Records, only to now never see any of his plans come to fruition. After Blood Money was killed, O Block was done playing games. Their intentions from this point were all bad, and they were about to get the victory they had been waiting for. On April 11, 2014, KI made a critical mistake. She would tweet out her location for everyone to see, including her enemies. She was walking on the 6400 block of South Eberhard with FBG Butter and Spoon from Gyro City. They were apparently headed to Wooski's house to celebrate Bostrell's birthday when a gunman hopped out of a vehicle, waved a few people out of his way so he could have a clear shot, and began to fire at KI and her friends. Butter and Spoon were hit in the foot and leg, but KI was hit 9 times in the chest, neck, and jaw. After being shot, she stumbled to a nearby home where she laid on some steps and took her last breath. The life of one of Chicago's youngest and deadliest female assassins in Chicago's gangland history was finally over. She lived a short, violent life, but this was the only life she knew. People speculated about who KI's killer was, but Chicago PD and other inside sources would later reveal that her killer was none other than King Von. In the end, the strange relationship and the affinity that some people claimed that Von had for KI apparently wasn't enough to stop him from pulling the trigger. He heard her drop her location, he got the drop on her, and he apparently took out another street demon who was responsible for killing several of his fellow O Block members. On August 14, 2020, one of STL FBG's most prominent members, Carlton Weekly, aka FBG Duck, was also shot and killed as he was standing in line at a Dos Cabana store with his girlfriend. According to several reports that have since come out in the media, 4 gunmen wearing masks jumped out of 2 cars and shot as many as 30 bullets at FBG Duck. Duck was hit 21 times and could be seen rolling around on the ground, suffering in agonizing pain for close to 20 minutes before the paramedics got there. From the footage I seen, nobody even attempted to render medical aid while he was laying there suffering. King Von is suspected of being one of the shooters in Duck's killing. Last week, an informant in police custody claimed that someone associated with O Block put a $50,000 bounty on Duck's head. A few days later, that $50,000 bounty was bumped up to $100,000. Apparently, someone's cooperating in this case, but as of now, there's 5 O Block members who are being charged with participating in FBG Duck's murder. Charles C. Murder Liggins, Kenneth Kenny Mac Robertson, T. Carlos Los Offer, Christopher C. Thang Thomas, and Marcus Muwap Smart are the 5 who are being charged. Meanwhile, King Von would continue his reckless life and continue to add more bodies to his body count. However, his time was also limited, as he would meet his demise a few years later on November 6, 2020. The details are still coming out, but King Von was apparently involved in a confrontation that resulted in 6 people getting shot. The altercation happened outside the Morocco Hookah Lounge in Atlanta. Several members that were affiliated with NBA Youngboy apparently crossed paths with Von and a group who were part of Little Durk's camp. This conflict didn't just start outside the club. This is an ongoing conflict that kicked off because these guys ended up running into each other. A lot of this stems from disrespect that's been going back and forth on social media between NBA Youngboy, Little Durk, King Von, and others who are affiliated with both of these labels. This is the same trend that's been taking place between rappers across the country. Whether it's jealousy, envy, rap beefs, or gang-related issues that escalated from the streets, these issues have been turning deadly for years. When the confrontation kicked off, it ended up spilling out into the street, where guns eventually came out and people started shooting. Von and Mark Blakely were both shot and killed minutes after the punches started being thrown. In the video footage, you can see who looks like Lil Tim and King Von going at it, and this might have been where Von gets shot. Another member of Von's crew goes to his aid and knocks Lil Tim off Von before they picked up Von and put him in the car to drive him to a hospital. I'll be doing a follow-up video on more of the details about King Von's murder, FBG Duck's murder, and another profile on 051 Melly, who was one of Lil Durk's most feared enemies. As I said in the beginning of this profile, I know there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of different people involved, and that it's easy to get lost in the confusion. Hopefully, I was able to simplify these events for you guys and bring it down to a level that made it as concise and as comprehensive as possible. Unfortunately, there's a lot of rappers who are getting caught up in these petty conflicts with other people and who end up squandering a chance to enjoy the fruits of their success. This is a trend that goes all the way back to Pac and Biggie, and I doubt it's gonna stop anytime soon. Is it really worth throwing your life away over and sabotaging all the success that some of you have worked so hard at trying to accomplish? I hope some of you young aspiring rappers are listening, and I hope some of you will start setting better examples for all those that are gonna come after you. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Hip Hop Hot Seat. For those of you who are getting into this series, we appreciate the support, and I can assure you that in time they'll get better. We're only into our 4th or 5th episode, but once we get our rhythm going, the content will get much better. Again, thank you for the support, and thank you for just continuing to stick with us, as we realize that without the support from you, our viewers, we would cease to exist.